to open, just a minute.
Yes.
To open the event, just a minute, I will be recording, so will you?
Okay, so dear friends and colleagues, welcome to the 7th workshop on children in crisis. This admirable event is the initiative of two people who for years now dedicated their efforts to one of the most challenging topics that can be researched: children in war, genocide, and the Holocaust. Dr. Boaz Cohen from Israel and Dr. Verena from Germany established the initiative of Children of War, Holocaust, and Genocide, the relevance of post-World War II and Holocaust for today's world. Apart from a website and a rich collection of material about this subject, Cohen and Busser also make sure to hold a workshop every year that is made up of experts, both historians and scholars, and people who work in the field. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Verena Busser.
We decided that I will open in the end, Daniela.
Okay.
Sorry. So
Dr. Cohen.
Anyone who's been working on children in the Holocaust knows the name of Professor Debórah Dwork, who is the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity in the Graduate Center, City University of New York. She was path-breaking in taking early oral recordings of Holocaust child survivors and weaving their story into her award-winning book, the leading one, which is Children with the Star, Flight from the Reich, Auschwitz, and the Holocaust. She's also a leading authority on the university education in Holocaust studies. She envisioned and actually the first doctoral program in the world, specifically in Holocaust history and genocide studies. She won many prizes. The Annette Fels-Kupperschmidt Award from the Dutch Auschwitz Committee and the Life Achievement Award from the International Network of Genocide Scholars. Inter alia, all this, she has also been a Guggenheim Fellow, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a senior scholar in residence at the USAGMM. Above all, Professor Dwork is a teacher and a mentor committed to training the next generation of Holocaust survivors. And Professor Dwork will talk to us about to whom did they belong, hidden Jewish children in the post-war Netherlands. If you have comments or questions, put them in the chat. We may be able to ask some of them. So, Professor Dwork, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very, very much. It's an honor to be here, to be working together with the two of you. Verena and Daniela, will you be posting the list?
The list
of terms that I sent through?
Can I talk to you about it later on?
No, everybody needs to see them. So I composed a list of names and terms that I will be using and sent them through to be posted. There is no final exam. You don't need to know these names. It was as a teaching tool because I will be using words which will be unfamiliar to you. And if you are like I am, and you hear something that's not, that you don't absorb immediately, you would turn to the person next to you and say, what did she say? So the point of the list is to ensure that you knew what I said. So is it not available? Is that what we're understanding?
It seems that it's not.
Obviously, there is no list. I have no list. I know that you said you would send a list, but I never received one.
That is possible. Our university is now migrating email systems. So many things have gone into cyberspace, and it's a headache for all. So I do apologize to everyone for not having checked on it. And let's get to the history that I will tell.
If you will move your camera a bit so your whole face will be in it, if it's possible. Yeah, this is better. Thank you. For posterity.
Great for letting me know. Let me see if I can, is that better?
No, this is better. This is excellent.
Perfect, great. So let's begin. Gerry Mock was 3 years old when the Germans invaded the Netherlands. He was nearly 5 when a family friend took him from his home in Amsterdam to hide at her house in Hoorn in February 1942. His parents were to come a day or two later, but they never arrived. They were deported and killed in Auschwitz. The house where Gerry was hidden also was raided, but he was saved by a Catholic family across the street with many, many children, and those children swooped him up into a game of hide and seek. He was put in a cupboard. Gerry subsequently was moved about 15 times, but the original family with whom he hid, his foster parents, kept in contact with him wherever he went. After liberation, they came to fetch me from my last address and took me home. Gerry lived with that foster family, and he went to school, and he waited for his parents to return. I expected them to come back, reasonable or not, and even notwithstanding the fact that people told me that probably my parents were dead, I expected my parents to come back. I expected everybody to come back, and no one came. It was Gerry's historical fate to be one of 3,512 Jewish children hidden in the Netherlands who were registered as war foster children, oorlogspleegkinderen, when the war was over. The question that arose was, to whom did they now belong? This problem had begun to worry rescuers long before the end of the war. Led by Gesine van der Molen, a severely Calvinist, strong-willed lawyer, they drafted a law pertaining to war foster children, which called for the establishment of a special guardianship commission called OPK. OPK was to be granted guardianship of all war foster children, quote, whose parents or guardians have not registered at the OPK office within 1 month of publication of this law. Read concentration camp survivors. The commission would be composed of members of the child rescue groups that had developed during the German occupation of the Netherlands. The authors clearly believed that it was they and not any Jewish community authority or civil child welfare bureaucracy who knew what was best for the children, because it was they who knew intimately the conditions under which the children had lived for the past 3 years, and because it was they who had risked their lives for the children. Indeed, the child rescue workers who wrote the bill, and Gesine van der Molen in particular, did not think that the hidden children's family members, or in certain cases, the parents themselves, were so competent to act in the children's best interests as they themselves were. As the proposed law clearly stated, Parents whose children are under the guardianship of OPK will have their parental authority returned to them by the judge when they are physically, spiritually, and socially capable of exercising that authority over their children. Most particularly, the authors wanted to erase the differentiation between Jewish and Christian Dutch citizens. They refused, they said, to continue to distinguish between Jews and non-Jews as the Germans had. Their goal was, quote, to come to a true melting together. But by refusing to distinguish, they also refused to differentiate. Treating all Dutch citizens equally, they ignored the special assaults their Jewish compatriots had endured and, consequently, their particular needs. The Netherlands was liberated on May 8th, 1945, and a few days later, the OPK Commission held a meeting to establish policy guidelines for the reunification of children with their biological families. To prevent disturbing or shocking changes, to maintain a stable environment for the child, in short, for the child's own good, close relatives were not to be given the current address of the children they sought to find. Parents' requests had to be judged individually on a case-by-case basis. At the same time, a newly reconstituted Jewish Communal Authority, the Jewish Coordinating Committee, or JCC, established its own Jewish Guardianship Association, which they called Ezrat Hayelad. The positions of the JCC and OPK were in direct contradiction. The JCC wanted Jewish orphans to be returned to the authority of Jewish communal bodies, as would have been the case before the war, when Protestants looked after Protestants, Catholics after Catholics, and Jews after Jews. They wanted to rebuild the Jewish community. The OPK insisted that the children remain where they were. They may or may not be returned to parents. They certainly should not be given to family members, and on no condition were they to be turned over to the authority of the Jewish community. Both parties were convinced that the program they advocated was in the best interest of the child. In fact, of course, while the programs they advocated may or may not have been in the best interest of the child, they certainly were in the best interest of their own ideologies. Despite the attempts of the JCC to enlist the sympathy of the government, the OPK legislation became law by royal decree in August 1945. The OPK, now an officially established body with 25 members, of whom 10 were Jews, gained guardianship of the orphans. In an article published shortly thereafter, the author, Caroline Aitje, pleaded for the return of the orphans to the Jewish community. She understood that many foster parents loved the Jewish children they had raised, but, she pointed out, the children had been entrusted to them, and what is entrusted must be returned. The issue, she argued, was straightforward. What community can, with impunity, give away its younger generation, those who embody the future? It would be an enormous disaster for that small remnant of Dutch Jews, which consists mainly of older men and women. That is the reason why the Jewish community must demand her younger sons and daughters, and why they cannot make any concession on this point. In an interview, Gesine van der Molen presented her position. Our commission considers the issue a Dutch affair, which must be solved in a national Dutch manner. Her plan, therefore, was to act in accordance with what the parents would have wanted. The wish of the parent comes first. This always will be respected, but often this is not known, and then we have to act according to probabilities. The weakness of van der Molen's plan, however reasonable it may have appeared, is that the placement of the child depended on someone's whose interpretation, how, of the wishes of the parents. Van der Molen sought to divine how the parents would have brought up their children by assessing their Jewishness, but her scale reflected what Calvinists thought Jews should do to be good Jews, not how Jews saw themselves. Earnest and well-meaning but perfectly ridiculous investigations were conducted to determine the degree of Jewish observance, and therefore the degree of Jewish identity, and therefore the presumed child-rearing practices and education plans of the parents for their children. Despite the efforts of the Jewish minority on the commission to educate the Gentile majority about the meaning and importance of culture as well as customs, the latter remained ignorant and oblivious. The majority argued, for instance, that the parents were not really Jewish because they did not keep a kosher home or because they had worked on Saturdays. Perhaps they married in synagogue to satisfy their own parents, and maybe they belonged to the community simply out of habit. In case after case, they denied a so-called positive Jewish environment in the home of the child's parents and recommended that the child remain with the foster parents. The judges invariably accepted their opinions and indeed sometimes went further. In one instance, a judge ruled that even though the father had attended synagogue regularly and the parents had kept a kosher home, they obviously did not have a Jewish way of life because their little girl had eaten non-kosher cookies in the home of a neighbor. In another case, the judge ignored the testimony of 3 women survivors of Auschwitz who attested to the wishes of little Hani Morpurgo's mother. Before her death, she had asked these women to make sure her daughter received a Jewish education. The judge found, however, that the woman was incapable of thinking logically. Holding fast to their concept of the best interest of the child and to their conviction that to separate a child from wartime foster parents would cause grave psychological harm, OPK supported the explicit political goal of assimilation and an implicit religious agenda of saving souls. The JCC and the Jews on the commission understood this only too well. Frustrated, they walked out, which finally prompted the government to consider the wishes of its Jewish citizens on this issue. OPK was ordered to cooperate with Ezrat Hayeled, and the Jewish members of OPK returned to the commission. Court battles continued to be waged, but the Jewish minority now had a more secure legal foundation for their case. It was so secure, in fact, that it changed Cherimok's life irrevocably. My foster parents were asked whether they would mind if, for a Jewish holiday, I would be in Jewish surroundings, to which they said, "Oh, no, of course not, fine. He is a Jewish child," and so on. So I went to several parties. One day, I went to a Hanukkah party, and they, my foster parents, came to fetch me, but it turned out it was an Aliyah Bet group, and my foster parents came to fetch me, but they did not get me. So I became a legal affair and a court affair, and in the end, I was put into the Jewish orphanage. The court took the decision that I should go to the orphanage and stay there until I was 21, which I did. We have heard about the adults' positions on the subject of the best interest of the oorlogspleegkind, but we have heard very little from the children themselves. And it is they, and only they, who can tell us what it meant to have been in hiding, to have waited, if they were old enough to remember, for their parents, to have been disappointed, as Cherimok was, or to have been reunited with that memory in the flesh. Max Arian was not yet 3 years old when he was taken from Amsterdam to a temporary address in the south of the Netherlands. I think I learned a lot there that has to do with the whole building of my character. I learned to be silent, not to sit in the window, to be sweet and be a nice little child. Shortly thereafter, Max moved to the Michaels family, where he was very much loved. But even there, he molded himself into a boy who would be little trouble or bother, and therefore allowed to remain. There was constant pressure to adjust, adapt, conform. As Cherimok explained, I always had the feeling that I was not behaving as if I were myself, but as if I were somebody else. I took my new identity and tried to live in that new identity. Max Arian and Cherimok lived with families who were fond of them. Other children did not. It was not easy to be in hiding, whether openly passing as a Gentile or hidden from the world. The children were hard pressed, safe for the moment, but also in the trap of gratitude and self-abnegation. They lived with people whom they felt obliged to please and towards whom they were beholden, because they, the Gentile adults, allowed the children to live, because they risked their lives also, because they too lived outside the law. For those Jewish children who were old enough to remember, the memory alone of family life was a source of strength and solace. Throughout the war, they preserved the hope or dream that someday the family would be reunited. In a vague, inchoate way, they presumed that when the war was over, they would resume their former life and the old structures and certainties would be restored. They never were, of course. Cherimok was just one of the thousands of Jewish orphans who had to accept and assimilate the loss of their parents after the war. Fewer children were united, as was Max, with one or both parents, but for no one did the past return as it had been, and the adjustment was not easy for anyone. Chedi and Max had very different experiences after the war. Chedi was sent to a Jewish orphanage. Max was returned to his mother and grandmother. but there are commonalities. A certain pattern emerges from their histories. First, and most obviously, they both had difficulties. What is not so obvious, but is equally true, is that the structure of either or choices, either the foster parents or the parents, either the foster parents or the extended family, either the foster parents or the Jewish community, those either or choices were a contradiction of the real needs of the child. Chedi was attracted to the Jewish community and attached to his foster family. The Aliyah Bet group that kidnapped him in 1947 urged him to emigrate to Palestine. His foster parents did not want him to leave them or the country. So I had this mixed feeling of, on one hand, nice that finally people spoke my own language, used my own words, could understand my own jokes, which was really important. So I didn't want to go. But on the other hand, I was very much attracted by the whole thing of Judaism and Jewish atmosphere. So I didn't know what I wanted. All I knew was that I wanted to stay with them. But on the other hand, I didn't want to stay with that family because I knew also that it was not home. It was a different social atmosphere, a different social background. In the end, Chedi knew he was, as he said, a stranger in the house. I knew I belonged somewhere else, and the somewhere else didn't exist anymore. Max, by contrast, was not faced with an either-or decision at the time or later, and notwithstanding his own considerable difficulties, he negotiated the transition with greater ease. In August 1944, his foster parents received a letter from Mrs. Arian, and they began to prepare the by then 4.5-year-old boy for her return. One day, his mother came by car. The car stopped and a lady got out. That's what I remember. And the rest is the story of my foster father. He said he looked out the window and saw my mother getting out of the car, and she just picked me out of that crowd of little children playing in the street. My mother asked him later on, "Why did you give me Max so easily?" And my foster father said, "When you picked out Max from all those children, of course we knew you were the mother of Max. It couldn't be otherwise." Max left with his mother, but she promised that they would return as soon as possible to stay for a few days, and she kept her word. Even after they returned to Amsterdam, she sent her son to his wartime foster family in the South, and she herself visited many times. The Catholic foster family in Limburg and the Jewish biological family were linked through Max, and the ties were never cut. In my memory, I was there on Easter and on Christmas, always on Christmas, and some of the summer holidays too when I was young. I did that even when I was a university student, and always I was very happy there. Through the history of children like Chedi and Max, we see that the Oorlogspleegkind controversy was over the children, but not about them. There were two issues at stake for the adults. The first, the ever unresolved problem of balancing collective versus individual good. What was best for the Jewish community was best for the Jewish child. What was best for the New Netherlands was best for the foster children. The second was the equally eternal problem of the hegemony of the dominant culture. Indeed, the children were called war foster children, not war orphans. They were seen from the perspective of the Gentiles who took them in, not from their own situation of loss and devastation. This history also reveals a pattern that pertains to the children. One way or another, each child integrated his or her pre-war and wartime experiences with his or her post-war life. It turned out impossible to create a divide in 1945 between the then and the now. Both were part of the child, and both found expression in their adult lives. Well, now that I've depressed everybody.
Thank you very much, Debórah,
Yes.
for this fascinating lecture.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I would like to ask a question. We are much, I'm teaching a course. This is Boaz. I'm
Yeah.
teaching a course on child rehabilitation after Holocaust and war. This is a course for education students. And the issue of the child's best interest is the center, turns out to be a major issue. Because we don't talk only about Jewish children, we talk also about the whole case of war children in Europe, and then we talk about the Jewish case. And I think the issue of the child best interest is really central to the whole story. There's Lynn Taylor's book now, The Child in the Child's Best Interest. Everything is, but I'm thinking that how could you explain the fact that the Netherlands is so different from everyone else? There's no other countries, if a parent or a close relative would come to claim a child, they will give him the child. The only country that was not this way, where there was a, I'm saying a direct relative, was the Netherlands. So this is really a radical when we look at it. So how do we explain this? I mean, why was everyone very clear that if a parent comes, he gets his child, apart from the Dutch legislature and the judiciary?
Well, actually, I see the situation slightly differently. In fact, I have read of cases, and you as well, I'm sure, of French Jewish children who were hidden in monasteries or convents and were not returned to family members. Italy, the same. In Poland, there were reported cases of foster parents who did not want to give up their children. What I see is that the Netherlands, what's different about the Netherlands, what's particular, I wouldn't call it special, but what is particular about the Netherlands is that they passed legislation about this. And in that, they are very much like New Englanders in the United States. If ever you want to find some evidence about property ownership and the role of women in the colonial times, just look at New England colony legislation. They're the most litigious people in the world, and they take everybody to court, each other mostly. And so it is with the Dutch. So the Dutch just make what is hidden elsewhere obvious and clear.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Dwork. We learned so much, and this issue of the child's best interest is indeed, and the way it goes on with the children further on is indeed a central issue then and probably today in similar cases.
There's just a kid. Let me just say one more thing, and then I will leave you to your deliberations and discussions. But just maybe 1 month ago, a case came up here in the United States about a Native American child who had been adopted by non-Native American, white, hegemonical parents. And the tribe was now suing to get custody of the child back again. So the question is, to whom did that child belong? What is in the best interest of that child?
Yes.
So
So
I
we still have much to ponder. Thank
Yes,
you very much.
it's a
May I
pleasure.
add something? Do you hear me?
Yes, I just,
Yes.
Yes, my name is Lena Neumark Spitz, and I live in Israel today. My parents worked for Le'ezrat HaYeled. My father even became at a certain stage the manager, and Le'ezrat HaYeled somehow helped my parents to reunite. Just to make the long story short, my parents met in 1939, and my mother, together with her family, escaped on the day of the invasion, the German invasion, with her family, parents and sisters, to England and then to the States. And they got engaged in writing in 1941. My father was in hiding, and when my mother wanted to return to Holland, it was not possible. She needed a special visa, even she was Dutch. And because she studied social work, Le'ezrat HaYeled, where my father already worked, asked for her to return to assist with all the hard work they had. And so they were reunited in November 45 and got married in January 46. And afterwards, a year later, I was born. So I don't know if you came across the names of members working on for Le'ezrat HaYeled besides the name of Caroline Eitje. Somehow I remember her name and maybe even her that she visited us, but I was a little child then. My father's name was Frederick Spitz, or he was called Frey in short. And he did a lot of work for this organization.
so I'm very sorry that I did not come across the name of your parents, but I'm very glad to hear about them now.
Yeah, I wrote you an email, but probably because of the email problems you said you have, but you didn't receive it.
Yes, you know what they call it progress.
Yes. Okay, but I'm just happy to share this story with you
Okay,
and the audience.
So I think, Debórah, also from my side,